Dzisiaj jest 4 lipca 2003 roku. Jestem w biurze.
Today is the 4th of July, 2003. I'm in the office of Malgorzata Tarasiewicz, head of Network of East-West Women Poland. We will talk about feminism and about life, about what kind of place feminism and your involvement in feminism have in your own life. How did it happen? Where did it come from? How did it start? Here's a request for you to tell a little bit about yourself, about where you were born, in what kind of a family, what your childhood was like, about the moment when you believe you started thinking about being a woman, about relations between men and women. But for now, please tell me where you were born and how you were beginning your life.
Twojego bycia kobietą, relacji pomiędzy mężczyznami a kobietami, ale na razie prośba o to, żebyś opowiedziała o tym, jak gdzie się urodziłaś, jak wchodziłaś w życie.
Welcome. I think I need to start at the very beginning, or actually even earlier than when I was conceived, because my family is the kind of family which suffered tragically as a result of World War II.
Rodziną, która bardzo tragicznie ucierpiała na skutek II wojny światowej. Ja się urodziłam już
I was born already quite a while after the war, but still I felt the painful consequences of what had happened then. Well, on my mother's side, only women survived the war, since all the male family members were killed.
Wszyscy męscy członkowie rodziny zostali zabici i moja prababcia, babcia.
And so my great-grandmother, my grandmother and my mother came to Sopot from Warsaw. Sopot belongs to the so-called regained territories, which means that this is where after the World War II there was a huge migration of people who either moved from the east, where they had been exiled from, or were coming here to the area unknown to them, because they didn't want to live in the places they had lived during the war. And this was the case of women from my family, because to them Warsaw, where they came from, was associated with such dramatic experiences that they wanted some change of place. And this way, these three women, my great-grandmother, grandmother and mother, found themselves in this completely new world, where they had to organize their lives from scratch. And never again did any man find his way into the lives of my great-grandmother or grandmother. My mother, on the other hand, had a brief relationship with my father, and I am, so to speak, the fruit of that. But then my father left Poland, and I didn't see him anymore for over 10 years.
Więcej go nie widziałam przez ponad 10 lat. Także właściwie wychowały mnie te trzy kobiety.
So I was raised by these three women who had gone through traumatic experiences and great loneliness, and for whom this post-war reality was very difficult, quite awful really. But in spite of that, they managed to cope in a completely new place, where they had to organize everything from scratch. And I was growing up in just this kind of surrounding, this environment, and I think this had a tremendous impact on me, because I didn't really know any men in my direct environment. Because even during the brief relationship my parents had, my father was in college in another city, so I was with women all the time. And so I didn't really feel what many people may feel, and that is that a man is somehow indispensable to, first of all, support the family. Because in my case, it all boiled down to the fact that my father didn't even pay child support, but I was fully supported by my mother. And it was the same when it came to my spiritual and intellectual development. There was somehow no male presence. There was only this romantic vision of my father, who sailed away as a hero, since he crossed the Atlantic on a lifeboat from the Batory. He just paddled away on this boat by himself across the Atlantic to America.
I właśnie odpłynął tą łodzią sam przez Atlantyk do Ameryki. I także tak właściwie postrzegam mężczyzn.
And so this is really how I perceived men, as really romantic heroes, perhaps, but completely removed from the reality, with whom I didn't really have any direct relations.
Nie mam żadnej bezpośredniej relacji.
It was just that later, for many years of my life, I'd only get postcards from various exotic places of the world, such as South America or the Caribbean. These were, of course, places where I wanted to go myself, but the whole thing just strengthened my conviction that my father had totally rejected me, because there was never any invitation for me to go with him to any of these places. So I just lived in communist Poland, and once in a while I just looked at postcards from exotic places, and also at the National Geographic that he bought me a subscription for. And these were his only business cards of sorts, the only way he marked his presence in my life. And I mean, this has certainly awakened. The only influence he had on me was a desire to travel, and an awareness that communist Poland was not the end of the world, but that there was another interesting world out there, which I would like to get to know at some point. I think it was some sort of opening to the world, and the fact, for example, that later on I studied English in college, it was just to learn the language that would be indispensable for getting to know the world.
Zdążyłaś jeszcze ojca poznać świadomie przed jego wyjazdem?
Did you have a chance to get to know your father in any real way before his leaving?
Well, not really, not at all.
Were you still a child?
Yes, I was a young child. No, not then, when I was still a child. Later on, when I was 19, I went to America because he lives in Miami. And this is actually also quite funny that out of all the places in the world, he lives in this huge resort-like place, which is associated with Charlie's Angels and so forth. And that is in Miami, Florida. And it was totally a great disappointment for me, so that by that time, the myth of my father had completely fallen apart, because it turned out that he was really a tyrant, who was screaming at his wife, and since morning yelling to her from upstairs to get him some pieces of clothing, and she, poor thing, was running around the place, finding things and getting them to him, which was not acceptable to me at all. And the second thing was that my father was trying to force my hand about what I should study. I mean, he wanted me to study electronics. And he said if I didn't feel up to it, that is, if I wasn't intellectually capable, I should then become a welder and weld pipelines in Alaska, because it was a very lucrative job. So at least I would be able to support myself. This complete lack of acceptance for my interests, for my choices, well, it was so terrible for me that I went back to Poland. And by the way, I went back in a very interesting time period, because it was right before Solidarity started. So thanks to this, I had an opportunity to participate in clearly more interesting activities and do things that were much more interesting than what I could have done in America. Not to mention the fact that if I were really to weld these pipelines, it would have been even more terrible.
bardziej byłoby to straszne, więc teraz jestem w kontakcie.
So nowadays I'm in touch with my father, but it's just dictated by some common sense, by the idea that I have to get to know him in order to get to know myself, in a way, and perhaps also in order to enable my son to have some contact with his grandfather. But it isn't really any close relationship.
Chciałabyś jeszcze coś powiedzieć o szkole?
Would you like to say something about your schools, your siblings?
You know, unfortunately, I have no siblings, not even step-siblings. But let me perhaps go back to my family. It's only that, because except for my father, there's nobody left from my immediate family. I've always been fascinated by trying to get to know even distant relatives, simply to figure out what my Warsaw part of the family was like, those who perished, and who were the people who came from Vilna, and in general, where my family's roots came from. And in fact, I have been making interesting discoveries. Just recently, I found a woman who is 92 years old and lives in Warsaw, and who told me the story of my family that had perished. And in the story there were also these two heroic women. One of them, unfortunately, was tortured and died at the Pawiak prison, and she had participated in the anti-German underground. And the other was killed during the ghetto uprising. So all that, you know, kind of, I mean, it's of course terrible what happened to them, but it gave me this sense of power, that they were so brave, and that in my family women provide me with such sense of support, and that women were perhaps the bravest, both the ones who fought during the war and the ones who had managed to wait it out somehow, hidden in some cellar, and then by themselves, here at these regained territories, managed to invent their lives in such terribly hard conditions. It's extremely important to me to search for women from my family and find out what they did. Men, on the other hand, were rather, that is as exemplified by my father, terribly disappointing, even though at the beginning I had these great expectations about who he was as this great hero who crossed the Atlantic in a boat.
You said that as a 19-year-old, you came back to Poland after a long stay in the U.S., right?
I mean, it was half a year. It was like that because I left during communist times, during Gierek's rule, and in fact the situation in Poland then was quite bad. So all my friends, all the people I knew from the English department, where I was already a student, figured that I would stay in America for good, that I would work in some company, producing some computer equipment, or having some other splendid, quote-unquote, career like that somewhere in America. However, for me, America was this, even apart from my father, but it was this kind of a plastic world. I mean, I think it was the question of Miami and these particular circles I found myself in, where I somehow couldn't find a place for myself because being active in the community had always been important to me. And there I somehow just couldn't find my own group. I mean, most likely if I had gone to college or traveled or even just started out in New York, it would certainly have been easier, and my stay there would have perhaps ended quite differently. But in general, this disappointment with my father and the impossibility of finding my kind of group made me come back, and I was very happy because of that. And I have never regretted that, even though when people saw me back here, they were shocked that somebody could have acted so silly and returned from this great America, where she could have stayed, to this terrible Poland.
W którym roku to było?
What year was that?
1980.
This was an important year for Poland.
Exactly. So after I returned, already after August 1980, I participated in the strikes at the university. And this is when the most interesting time of my life started. This was simply, it seems to me that since the moment I had come back, and then there was martial law and so on till 1989, and it was the stage of my life which shaped my personality and my social vision most intensely, because things were happening very quickly then. So I was learning a lot of things. I mean, every new day, almost every day would bring something new. All these intense relations with people. And I think this can't happen in such a stable country as America, unless you're some Black Panthers activist or something. I don't know. Only in exceptional situations. But here it was accessible to broad circles, and luckily I found myself in these circles. And that's why I'm happy I returned. And later I started collaborating with the Freedom and Peace movement, where my development as a person and social and political activities intensified even further.
Gdzie jeszcze jakby się zintensyfikował właśnie mój rozwój i działalność społeczna i polityczna
And in retrospect, I believe that this was the most important, the most interesting time of my life.
And this was just the beginning of the 1980s, right?
I mean, it started at the beginning of the 80s, but then it went on for close to a decade, till 1989. And it was just then, when the roundtable started, or maybe even earlier, that I went through this huge disappointment about how this struggle against communism ended, in what kind of an imperfect way, so far from what I had imagined. And that's when this new period started, this period of when the blinders kind of started to fall off my eyes, and so did my fascination with possibilities created by the fall of communism. But it was kind of a more pragmatic, more realistic period, perhaps more unpleasant, less creative, but at the same time also very important and interesting as well. And this was because at that point I started to get involved in women's rights.
So how exactly did it start with women's rights?
I mean, with the women's rights issues, it really all began still during the times of the Freedom and Peace movement, because the Western women's organizations were very much interested in learning what was going on here, what this grassroots movement was like, whether women participated, and so on and so forth. And there was this conference, the so-called Żytnia Street Conference, where the Freedom and Peace movement activists met with, at the beginning of my activities in the Freedom and Peace movement, there was a well-known conference at Żytnia Street in Warsaw, where activists from the Freedom and Peace movement met with representatives of various grassroots, left-wing groups from Western Europe, and feminists came to that too.
Oddolnych, lewicowych z Europy Zachodniej. I tam właśnie przyjechały feministki. To było moje pierwsze spotkanie z...
This was my first meeting with people who would later become very important to me. They were famous feminists and less known ones. There were women who were involved, who worked in this organization, War Resistance International, for example. There was a feminist writer, Mena Kostash, from Canada. There was a nurse, Vibeke, from Holland, who taught us how to create support groups. This woman from the War Resistance International, for example, would teach how to organize civil resistance. That is what the civil disobedience was all about, and in what way to resist, the non-violent way to resist. And I mean, this was also a very interesting experience. At the same time, they were all feminists. And it was very, I mean, I liked what they were talking about very much. And they were kind of completely, I had an impression that they were defining things I knew about, but I didn't realize they really existed. I mean, I realized various things such as, for example, discrimination. Even within the freedom and peace movement, with this domination of men in the movement, for example. And I had known that, but it didn't seem possible to go against. The only solution seemed to be like these men, of course, and then at this point, it would be possible to become visible, to become a leader as important as they were. Being a woman, on the other hand, with the value system and behavior patterns kind of typical for women, was something that didn't give an opportunity to become a leader. And these women made me aware that this was not the case, that women in the West and in the States felt the same, and that they actively opposed that. And some of them decided this was a problem, and this is how a really big movement started. Some of them, but in various places. So they wouldn't be thought of as a few women in one central place that decided about that. And these women brought together a few women from the freedom and peace movement, who also thought similarly, and they believed it was possible to change things. I mean, by listening to women from the West. Later on, they were also sending us a lot of publications and coming many more times, so that there were really endless conversations I had, and I got a lot from them.
Do you remember what year that was?
It was 1985. No, I'm sorry, 1986. And I remember that these talks were also attended by women, some of whom, at least one in Poland and one in Hungary, play an important role in the women's movement. In Poland, Urszula Nowakowska from the Center for Women's Rights was one of the people who were at Żytnia Street. But there was also one of the leading Hungarian feminists who was also at the beginning of her involvement, and she collaborated with us. Judith Oczary. So these were those first steps. And then I started to, this paper was published. Our group, more anarchistic than other groups in the freedom and peace movement, published it in Gdańsk. It was called A Cappella, and I wrote feminist pieces there maybe twice. One of them was about the Miss Polonia contest, and the other was a more general piece about feminism, about foundations for feminism, about assumptions behind feminism. And I have to admit that even our anarchist male friends, who, one would think, should receive this kind of pieces favorably, reacted with nervousness. So it gave me some food for thought. What's the big deal? Why was it that speaking about freedom for women, about a possibility of women making choices, about the idea that women should not be treated as objects, why did it provoke such an unbelievable resistance, even among anarchists? This was shocking to me, and it also kind of made me aware that this meant that something was at stake, that the problem did exist, that it wasn't, as it could seem, that it existed but only far away somewhere. But that it existed close by, if even my male friends with whom we were protesting in the street and collaborating were suddenly against us when it came to the women's issues. And so the news about my involvement in feminism somehow got around, And that's how I got my work in solidarity, this next stage, already after 1989. When I became a coordinator of the National Women's Section, there is a person responsible for building this section from scratch.
Czyli osobą odpowiedzialną za zbudowanie takiej sekcji od początku, dlatego że mimo że kobiet...
It was because even though there were very many women in solidarity, after all, many women worked for the underground and played exceptionally important roles. Later on, it turned out that there were no women in the union's leadership, and that there actually was no single unit within the union that would represent women's issues. And because international labor unions put such pressure on solidarity that they need to do something for women, and because solidarity had to take into account that they were getting donations from the Western Union headquarters, they thought they had to kind of cave in. So they decided to employ a person who'd organize such a section and would coordinate it.
Zatrudnić osobę, która taką sekcję kobiet zorganizuje i będzie ją koordynować.
There was only this disappointment and a sore spot for Solidarity's bosses that evolved from this, and it resulted from the fact that this women's section acquired an authentic character, that women's interest in it was significant, that these women started to formulate postulates that were very important to them. This kind of surpassed what the Solidarity's bosses expected concerning how these women would sound and how well organized they would become. That's why the women's section reached the end of its life in a rather sudden and dramatic way. That was because the women simply formulated two postulates, and these two postulates were kind of critically important. And since others had no major significance when it came to this problem, the problem of acceptance by the union leadership. The postulate concerning abortion, on the other hand, and the one about women's participation in the union's governance were critically important. Because exactly at that point, at the beginning of the 90s, there was an ongoing debate about what kind of anti-abortion legislation, that is, whether such legislation should be implemented and how it was to be formulated.
Na temat tego, jaka ma być ustawa zakazująca aborcji, znaczy czy w ogóle ma być tego typu ustawa i jak ona ma być sformułowana. No i niestety
And that is unfortunately, Solidarity as an organization closely affiliated with the Catholic Church believed that the law should be introduced. A very restrictive anti-abortion law should be introduced. And this was a resolution passed by the Solidarity Congress in 1992, I think, or maybe it was in 1991, I don't remember. The only problem was that among the Congress delegates there were around 10% of women, while in the Union the numbers were more or less even. That is, the ratio of men to women was more or less 50-50. And women were very discouraged and upset by this resolution. And this newly created women's section formulated a goal to change, to exert an influence on Solidarity's position on abortion. Of course, it was completely utopian to imagine that something like this was possible. Nonetheless, we were faithful to our values and adamant in our support for this postulate. The end result was that when the anti-abortion legislation reached the Senate, that is after the first readings in the same, when it was passed to the Senate representatives invited representatives of various women's organizations, including representatives from the women's section, for the so-called community consultations.
Zaprosili przedstawicielki różnych organizacji kobiecych, w tym przedstawicielki sekcji kobiet Solidarności, na tak zwane konsultacje społeczne.
But of course, neither senators nor the Solidarity leadership expected the views expressed by Ms. Anastasia Konieczna, a representative of the women's section, who, by the way, was considered an authority among activists from Solidarity, from the opposition. She was a worker from Wrocław, and she would speak against this restrictive legislation. And this, of course, was the beginning of an end. Because the moment when, as long as Kaczyński was the head of Solidarity, and he is a pragmatic politician, so he didn't use repressive measures against the women's section. He, just like Wałęsa, by the way. This was actually quite interesting to me that, or perhaps it was because they minimized the significance of the women's section. They didn't see it as threatening, so perhaps it wasn't worth it. This is when their pragmatism became visible, that they didn't think it was worth it to raise this issue, to go against this, because it would simply die of natural causes anyway. On the other hand, the moment when narrow-minded Krzaklewski came to power, who was really, his power, I feel, didn't come from any charisma or from some broad support among union members, but from this specific political arrangement, where he was close to the church and he had its support. For him, the existence of the women's section with all these, from the perspective of the church, that is, with this one postulate against implementing the anti-abortion legislation was tragic, because it could in a way threaten his position in relation to the church. So he kind of undertook steps toward repressing and dissolving the women's section. And these were, and also I was, of course, quite naive at that point, and I didn't have the kind of experience in political activity I have today. So it was kind of easy for him. He resorted to, well, totally absurd devices, and he didn't want, every section had to have a charter registered by the National Commission. So, for example, so the item that the women's section charter was to be discussed and accepted by the National Commission was never placed on the agenda. There were always more important matters, and this never found its way, was never discussed. But when at one point, at the last moment, we managed to get the charter on the agenda and was about to be discussed, Krzaklewski brought up some totally absurd points, that the name couldn't be the National Women's Section, but only the National Section of Women, and other such stuff. And he just took it off the agenda so that it couldn't be voted on. As a result, later on, he claimed that the women's section was illegal, even though I was legally and formally employed as a women's section coordinator. And he would simply invite me to his office and drag me into hours of conversations when he used some absurd argumentation. He was talking about, he was trying to convert me to his position, and I, in my naivete, was trying to convert him to mine, which was a complete nonsense. And psychologically, he got me to the point that I just figured it wasn't worth it. The section's activists were harassed in this way, for example, that they weren't sent to any training abroad. One woman from Białystok didn't go because, as she was told, she was for abortion, so she couldn't represent the union abroad. The section members were forbidden to use phones in the regional union offices so that they couldn't keep in touch with each other, and so on and so forth. And finally, it got to the point when I was being blackmailed, so that I completely withdrew from this. Not as a result of the blackmail, but because I decided it made no sense, and that it'd be better to make people aware, to show outside what it was all really like, and to repudiate this women's section, which Solidarity had created later. This kind of a facade women's section, than to keep working there all the time and try to change things from within. So the report was prepared for the Helsinki Human Rights Foundation. No, I'm sorry, it was the Human Rights Watch, that's what it's called. and it's an equivalent of the Helsinki Foundation, but in the US. The report was about the women's section, about how the women's section was repressed, and generally about what the situation of women's rights in the union was like. And this story kind of it got to be quite well known in its time. Nonetheless, the union didn't, of course, back out of their position, and the women's section ceased to exist in its previous shape, but the facade section was created, consisting only of women from the right.
O tym, jak sekcja kobiet, dotyczący tego, jak sekcja kobiet została zrepresjonowana i jak w ogóle wygląda sytuacja praw kobiet w związku. No i jakby stała się ta historia była dosyć głośna w swoim czasie. Tym niemniej związek nie wycofał się oczywiście ze swojego stanowiska i sekcja kobiet przestała istnieć w tym kształcie, jak istniała, tylko została powołana fikcyjna sekcja składająca się z kobiet prawicy.
And now you're an NGO activist. When did it start, your interest in the women's movement?
Kiedy to się zaczęło, twoje zainteresowanie ruchem kobiecym?
I mean, all of this has been this kind of continuum, because while I was still working for Solidarity, I was invited to a meeting of kind of feminist leaders from Central Eastern Europe, which took place in Dubrovnik, and was organized by feminists from the US and from Croatia.
Które się odbyło w Dubrowniku i organizowały to feministki ze Stanów Zjednoczonych i z Chorwacji. To była
And there was Slavenka Drakulic, for example, Shana Pan, I mean many women from the US who were interested in the Central Eastern Europe region, because, for example, the roots go back to Central Eastern Europe. And there were many women from our region, from Central Eastern Europe, who wanted to work together to get more strength. And it was a kind of important impulse for me. It was intellectually, but also in terms of organizing, because this is when the organization I work for today, the Network of East-West Women, was created. And since that time, which means for 10 years already, perhaps more than 10 years, I have affiliated with this organization, even though I had some breaks. Because for a while I worked for the Amnesty International, had a baby, and for some time I lived in the United States and wasn't involved in any activities. It was as late as the end of my stay in the States when I started working for the network. And then I got a proposition to, since I was going back to Poland, wouldn't I want to organize such an institution here in Poland? That is, to organize a branch of this organization in Poland. And that's how it all came into being. In 1999, the Polish network was created, and it has been developing ever since.
I potem zaproponowano mi, że skoro wracam do Polski, że czy nie chciałabym takiej organizacji tutaj w Polsce, znaczy jakby zorganizować oddziału tej organizacji w Polsce i właśnie w ten sposób to powstało. W 1999 roku powstał network polski i się rozwija do tej pory.
What are you particularly interested in within the network? You're also collaborating with all the major feminist organizations in Poland, so what are your interests? What do you consider to be your priorities?
At this point, it seems to me that, at the beginning I was, of course, fascinated by this kind of activity, regional activity. In the region, and I'm thinking about the whole region of Central Eastern Europe, and I'm still interested, of course. And even the global feminist movement is also incredibly inspiring, of course. But right now, I treat these mostly as inspirations, while I believe that the important thing is to transfer these experiences and values into my own direct surroundings. At this point, the most important thing for me is working in Poland, in the entire country, but also right here in the area, in the Pomeranian region, because, in fact, I have already participated in activities of various gender caucuses, or women's groups, which pop up at some United Nations conferences, such as, for example, the conference about creating the International Criminal Law Tribunal. And I also worked at the conference Peking +5, And now I'm very much interested in this World Summit about the Information Society. And I well know, I mean, it seems to me that I well know the process of such a global collaboration of women at the United Nations level.
Podczas konferencji Pekin +5. Teraz bardzo się interesuję takim szczytem światowym dotyczącym społeczeństwa informacyjnego i dokładnie znam, znaczy wydaje mi się, że może nie dokładnie, ale dobrze znam proces takiego globalnej współpracy kobiet na szczeblu ONZ-u.
But when I do that, I also see how huge the gulf is between what is going on at the United Nations level, what our resolutions are, because there's always some women's working group which kind of accepts some resolutions and defines priorities for the coming years, and they are generally really wonderful. But I have an impression that later on a local level, nobody knows about these. First of all, or few people know about it, or maybe really it's nobody. Few people know about it, and apart from that, it is frustrating that implementation of these postulates is very limited, at least in Poland.
I poza tym jest frustrujące to, że jakby realizacja tych postulatów jakby no, istnieje przynajmniej w Polsce w bardzo ograniczonym stopniu. Że nawet rzeczywiście udaje nam się.
So even if we succeed in lobbying with the representatives of the Polish government who attend a given conference in New York or Geneva, very little comes out of that later. It is in fact written down somewhere in some documents which are stashed in Polish, or they get signed like in the case of Peking +5, or ratified, but little comes out of that. And this is what interests me, this kind of transfer into this very local level of all of these resolutions, all big and magnificent and memorable, which are passed somewhere, but which, I sometimes think, are just art for art's sake. That's because even if 5 women in Warsaw know about these, and they even polish up some formulations, or decide where to place a comma, this has no follow-up on the level of some village or some small town. And that's why, for example, I'm interested, for example, in the issue of using new technologies for women. I mean, it seems to me, this is something that's maybe very mundane and technical, but I think it's very important because the European Union and the structural funds will provide some opportunities, I hope, of financing some bigger opportunities for women, of taking advantage of new technologies.
Jest to może takie bardzo prozaiczne i techniczne, ale myślę, że to jest bardzo ważne, dlatego że Unia Europejska i fundusze strukturalne dadzą jakieś możliwości, mam nadzieję, sfinansowania większych możliwości korzystania przez kobiety z nowych technologii.
And our organization would like to prepare these. Would like to participate in these programs. And at the same time, it would like to give these women not just the knowledge of how to technically use the internet or email, how to use them, for example, for their business enterprises or for agritourism. I believe, however, that our task is to inform women through network sources where to look for information about how to fight with violence against women, how to find out about some possibilities, for example, of influencing some government work, how to reach the government representative for women's issues, how to even find out that somebody like that even exists, and how to monitor her work, and how to bring up new ideas, so that these new technologies could give them an opportunity for exchanging information, to know what's going on with women, what rights women have all over the world.
Jak można podrzucać nowe pomysły, żeby po prostu nowe technologie były rzeczywiście takim, dały im możliwość wymiany i wiedzy o tym, co się dzieje z kobietami, jakie są prawa kobiet na całym świecie, że to jest jakby taka
And this is kind of an opportunity of opening up the world. And this is perhaps my hobby these days, this opportunity. It's perhaps because while working for the network of East-West women, I saw that in the Central Eastern Europe region, there are so many opportunities of using the internet for this exchange of information.
You belong to the group of a few, of several most well-known Polish feminists. Your activities are known both within the feminist circles and outside. And could you tell me also how your feminism is carried out in your own life? Apart from your work in women's organizations, could you say that in your own private life, among friends, you're also a feminist?
Czy mogłabyś powiedzieć, że, że też w swoim własnym środowisku, tym bardziej prywatnym, jesteś też feministką?
I mean, I think so. And it wasn't easy for me in my private life. I don't mean being a feminist in my private life, but achieving a status quo when my feminism is respected, that it meets that my partner, or rather my partners, since it's not the case that I've been with only one man all these years, become feminists themselves. It wasn't simple, and I think that perhaps it resulted from my naive choices, because, as I've said before, when I was growing up only among women, I really didn't know men at all. It was this kind of image, this kind of picture shaped by films and reading, but it didn't really apply to any real men, and definitely not a Polish man. It was a kind of an image or of an ideal, who was a feminist, a partner, and so on. And that's why my choices were, I think to some extent, naive. Because I wouldn't choose a man who already was a feminist, but it seemed to me that everything would be very simple. If only we could be together, if we loved each other, that would all happen naturally. And that love would be translated into the mutual acceptance of our values and ideals. But sometimes it was just terribly hard work. And sometimes I was wondering if it was worth it. But now I think it was. It's that after 10 years with my last partner, I think we've come very close to the situation when feminist principles and feminist values are being carried out in our relationship. But it was a gradual process of getting there. When it comes to my son, on the other hand, now we're raising him in the spirit of respect for women, of course, and for women's rights, human rights, and tolerance for otherness. I hope that it won't happen that, as I hear it sometimes happens, that when the parents are of liberal views, or the other way around, when they are fascist, their child suddenly becomes a punk, And perhaps our son will suddenly join the all-Polish youth organization. But I do whatever I can to prevent that. For now, I hope everything is fine.
Bardzo się zbliżyliśmy, że właśnie zasady feminizmu, te wartości feministyczne były realizowane w naszym związku. Ale to było stopniowe dochodzenie. Natomiast jeśli chodzi o mojego syna, no to ja go wychowuję, oboje teraz go wychowujemy w takim właśnie duchu poszanowania dla kobiet oczywiście, dla praw kobiet, praw człowieka, tolerancji dla inności. Mam nadzieję, że właśnie nie nastąpi coś takiego, co jak słyszę czasami, że następuje, że właśnie, że jeżeli rodzice są, właśnie mają poglądy liberalne, czy są, albo na odwrót, że są faszystami, to że nagle ich dziecko staje się punkiem, prawda? Albo że nasz syn nagle przystąpi do młodzieży wszechpolskiej, prawda? No, ale po prostu robię co mogę, żeby tak nie było, więc na razie mam nadzieję, że wszystko jest w porządku.